All right, so welcome to the deep dive. We're going to be taking a deep dive into a concept that was presented by Nick Freiling in his article, An Inconvenient Horizon, Apocalypse versus the Cult of an Endless Tomorrow.
Hmm.
And this came out just this past March, so it's hot off the presses.
Yeah.
And when we hear the word apocalypse, I think a lot of us think, end of the world, fiery, kind of
Yeah.
brimstone, kind of a thing.
Mm.
But really, Freiling is building on some ideas from David Bentley Hart and suggests that we look at it a little differently, not just as a catastrophic end,
Right.
but as an unveiling.
Yeah, and I think that shift in perspective
Yeah.
is key right off the bat because, yeah, it is easy to get caught up in the Hollywood version,
Right.
or the kind of cartoon version of what apocalypse means. But the Greek word apocalypsis really means a revelation, a making known.
Yeah.
And Freiling really uses that lens to examine our modern obsession with progress, and this kind of almost ingrained belief in an endless tomorrow.
Right.
And contrasts this with a much older way of seeing things.
Yeah, exactly. And to really kind of get a grasp of this contrast, I think we need to take a little historical detour.
Okay.
Freiling points to David Bentley Hart's argument that early Christianity wasn't primarily about new doctrines or rituals,
Right.
but was fundamentally apocalyptic. And Hart really puts it in some stark terms.
Yeah.
He describes it as an urgent call to all persons to come out from the shelters of social, cultic, and political association
All right.
into a condition of perilous and unprotected exposure, dwelling nowhere but in the singularity of this event, for the days are short. So you can imagine that feeling of urgency, that radical detachment from the normal ways of life under the Roman Empire, that, according to Hart, was the essence of early Christianity.
Yeah.
So, for those early believers, life wasn't about building a comfortable present, but bracing for an imminent unveiling. And that really makes worldly attachments almost irrelevant.
Yeah. What's striking there is that sense of immediate expectation.
Yeah.
That the early followers of Jesus lived with this intense anticipation of things being radically changed very soon.
Yeah.
And their focus wasn't on establishing long-lasting earthly structures,
Right.
but on this coming revelation.
Right.
And they were, as Hart describes, willingly vulnerable,
Yeah.
not seeking security in the social norms of their time.
Right, right. And as Freiling notes, that intense apocalyptic focus didn't exactly stay that way.
Okay.
As Christianity grew, gained wider acceptance and crucially political power under Constantine, the landscape kind of shifted.
Yeah.
The church evolved into more of an established institution, and the emphasis, and understandably perhaps moved toward maintaining stability and navigating the political realities. That initial, almost laser-like focus on the imminent end seemed to recede a little bit.
Yeah. And it's a very human story, isn't it? When any movement transitions from being on the fringes to holding influence, the priorities naturally adapt.
Yeah.
Running institutions demands a different mindset than living with a sense of constant, immediate anticipation.
Sure.
And even those early monastic movements, which often aimed to recapture that original radicalism, tended to develop their own sets of rules and frameworks over time.
Yeah.
Sustaining that initial raw sense of immediacy institutionally seems to be a real challenge.
Right. And Freiling acknowledges that these historical interpretations can be debated.
Right.
But the core idea that he's highlighting, and I think you'll agree with this, is this significant difference between that early, intense apocalyptic focus and how Christianity and arguably society in general operates today. Which brings up a question, in our modern lives, which are so packed with schedules, commitments, and long-term plans.
Yeah.
How easy or even possible is it for us to maintain that kind of apocalyptic worldview?
Right.
That primary focus on the end of the current order.
That's really the central tension that Freiling explores, isn't it?
Yeah.
The sheer pace and complexity of modern life create a powerful momentum towards planning and building for the future, both individually and as a society. And this inherently relies on an assumption of continuity, a belief in a reasonably predictable tomorrow.
Yeah.
And the very notion of an imminent unveiling that could disrupt all of that
Right.
can feel quite foreign even unsettling to us.
Absolutely. And let's dig a little deeper into what we mean by apocalypse as unveiling.
Okay.
Freiling reminds us that the Greek word apocalypsis isn't just about destruction. It signifies the sudden appearance of God, something that was previously hidden becoming clearly visible in our midst.
Right.
He even touches on Mircea Eliade's idea of the eternal return in religious rituals, this concept of connecting with the sacred, by, in a sense, stepping back into a primordial time.
That connection to unveiling really broadens the significance.
Yeah.
It's not solely about some future cataclysm.
Right.
It also points to the potential for a present personal revelation.
Right.
And this creates a fascinating dynamic with the more common understanding of apocalypse as a future event.
Right.
Freiling emphasizes that this unveiling this apocalypse doesn't necessarily wait for those who are completely absorbed in pursuits that have nothing to do with this ultimate horizon.
Right.
Those who have, as Jesus put it, buried their talent or mina.
Yeah.
And of course, the timing of that larger day and hour remains unknown.
Right.
So while we might be caught up in our daily routines, the possibility of this unveiling, both personally and more broadly, is always present.
So while we might be, seeking personal revelation, the possibility of a larger apocalyptic event, however we understand it, still remains.
Right.
And this brings us back to the challenge for modern society. Freiling argues that our entire way of life is so structured around planning, around forward thinking, around these meticulously organized schedules that inherently assume a predictable future.
Exactly. We are conditioned to value control, or at least the feeling of it.
Right.
And letting go of that, even conceptually, can be psychologically challenging. The uncertainty that comes with an apocalyptic worldview can understandably generate anxiety and fear, and in societies that experience relative prosperity, that sense of urgency about the end can feel very distant indeed. When our basic needs are met and our focus is often on growth and advancement, the idea of everything being fundamentally upended can seem abstract and even irrelevant.
Right, and this leads to a key point in Freiling's article, his concern about the fading of this apocalyptic awareness, particularly in the context he was observing following a presidential inauguration. And amidst renewed optimism about the economy and technological progress, he suggests that in such times, people who remind us of our limitations, of the fragile nature of our existence, can be seen as unwelcome voices, as obstacles to this dominant narrative of progress.
What's interesting here is how the prevailing societal mood can really influence our openness to what we might call eschatological thinking, thinking about the end times or the ultimate destiny of things. When things seem to be going smoothly, when there's a strong sense of optimism about the future. The idea of an impending end or a radical unveiling that disrupts everything can feel out of sync and unwelcome. It's a perspective that doesn't easily align with the dominant narrative of upward trajectory.
And Freiling then uses Donald Trump's rhetoric as a really clear example of this anti-apocalyptic sentiment. Think about those constant promises of unbounded winning of a future, free from any decline. He even quotes Trump saying, "We're going to win so much, you're going to be so sick and tired of winning. In 4 years, we'll have it fixed so good, you're not going to have to vote again. We're going to become so rich, you're not going to know how to spend all that money." So this really paints a picture of this never-ending golden age.
As a vision of perpetual triumphs. A complete rejection of any endpoint that suggests limits or endings. And this kind of rhetoric taps into a very human desire for security and advancement, but it also implicitly denies the inherent uncertainties and the finite nature of human existence that an apocalyptic worldview traditionally emphasizes.
And it's not just in the political sphere. Freiling also highlights Brian Johnson and his "don't die" mantra as another powerful example of this pushback against eschatological horizon. Johnson states, "We are at war with death and its causes. We are building towards an infinite horizon. We are fighting for the freedom to exist as long as one chooses." So this is really a direct challenge to the traditional understanding of mortality, isn't it?
Absolutely. Johnson's ambition to essentially engineer a way around death and to create a society focused on preventing it represents a radical departure from a worldview that accepts death as an inevitable part of the human condition, and often links it to broader ideas about the end and what comes after. If death is no longer seen as the ultimate boundary, it fundamentally reshapes our understanding of meaning and purpose.
And Freiling raises a concern here that this techno-nationalist optimism, this drive for limitless progress, can lead people to find their primary identity in these grand projects, promising a kind of earthly salvation. He worries that this can overshadow the importance of that broader eschatological perspective. He even contrasts this with St. Paul's powerful words in Galatians 3:28. There is neither Jew nor Greek. There is neither slave nor free. There is neither male nor female. For you are all one in Christ Jesus. So the idea that in Christ, these worldly distinctions, these projects of earthly greatness lose their ultimate significance.
That's a crucial connection.
Yeah.
You know, when our sense of self becomes solely tied to these temporary worldly endeavors, whether they're political movements or technological advancements, it can obscure a deeper understanding of our shared humanity and our ultimate destiny, however we conceive of it. Paul's words emphasize a fundamental unity that transcends these earthly categories, a unity rooted in a spiritual reality.
And Freiling argues that apocalypse understood as this disruptive unveiling is actually a vital aspect of Christian living. He suggests that neglecting this eschatological horizon can lead to some pretty negative outcomes like bigotry and violence. So how does he draw that connection?
Well, the argument is that when we place absolute faith in limitless progress, and believe we can achieve a perfect utopian future solely through our own efforts, it can foster a lack of humility and an intolerance for differing viewpoints. If we believe we are on an inevitable path to perfection, then anyone who questions that path or highlights potential limitations can be seen as an enemy of progress, as someone hindering this glorious future. This can then lead to the marginalization and even persecution of those who don't fit the dominant vision. The apocalyptic consciousness, by constantly reminding us of our inherent limitations and the ultimate uncertainty of our human plans, encourages a greater sense of humility and dependence on something beyond ourselves.
And he then brings in some really powerful words from the book of James, chapter 4, verses 13 through 16, about the uncertainty of the future and the sheer arrogance of boasting about our plans. Come now, you who say, today or tomorrow we will go into such and such town and spend a year there and trade and get game. Yet you do not know what tomorrow will bring. What is your life? For you are a mist that appears for a little time and then vanishes. Instead, you ought to say, if the Lord wills, we shall live and do this or that. As it is, you boast in your arrogance. All such boasting is evil. That really hammers home the idea of human plans being ultimately fragile and subject to forces beyond our control.
It's a stark reminder of our limited perspective. And the potential for hubris when we assume too much control over the future. The passage advocates for a posture of dependence, acknowledging that our lives and our plans are ultimately contingent. This stands in direct contrast to the kind of self-assuredness that often accompanies the belief in endless progress and human perfectibility.
So Freiling concludes by emphasizing that the Christian stance isn't one of conquest or building a perfect worldly future, but rather one of surrender, because ultimate reality lies beyond our ability to control or even fully comprehend. He even quotes Jesus from Matthew 16, verses 24 through 26. If any man would come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. For whoever would save his life will lose it, and whoever loses his life for my sake will find it. For what will it profit a man if he gains the whole world and forfeits his life? So this seems to directly challenge the pursuit of worldly gain and earthly security as the ultimate goals in life.
Precisely. These words of Jesus call for a radical reorientation of our priorities. A willingness to let go of the relentless pursuit of worldly success and security in favor of a deeper spiritual reality. Freiling connects this back to Hart's description of that original apocalyptic call to perilous and unprotected exposure, even drawing a parallel to Christ's own death and burial. The ultimate message here is that this unveiling, this coming reign of God, isn't just something that's going to happen way off in the future. It's also something that is breaking into the present, here and now.
So to really tie it all together, we've explored this compelling tension that Nick Freiling brings to light, the stark contrast between the urgent, world-renouncing concept of apocalypse in early Christianity, this idea of a constant potential unveiling, and the modern, often relentless pursuit of endless progress and our deep-seated desire to maintain control over the future. This inconvenient horizon of apocalypse really throws a wrench in those temporal priorities that we often hold on to so tightly.
Absolutely. And hopefully this deep dive has given you a fresh perspective on the term apocalypse, encouraging you to look beyond just the images of a catastrophic end and consider its deeper meaning as a revelation, a moment of profound truth that can challenge our assumptions about the world and our place in it.
And on that note, here's a thought to really chew on.
Okay.
Consider how acknowledging this inconvenient horizon, this ultimate uncertainty that Freiling discusses, might fundamentally shift the way you look at your daily life, your long-term plans, and even the personal and societal goals you're currently pursuing. What deeper truths or realities might be unveiled when we gently question the illusion of an endless tomorrow and the complete predictability of our earthly endeavors. Thanks for taking the deep dive with us.